RF exposure can seem pretty daunting, while also being somewhat ambiguous, right? And there are a lot of different narratives out there about what RF can do to a worker or even a civilian. So from a technical standpoint, what is RF exposure and what does overexposure look like? What does it do to a worker?
So now I have a chance to test my non-ionizing pronunciation again. But it's just that. It is technically some sort of radiation exposure. And the thing is, I think that sounds a lot scarier than it really is. There are certainly hazards that are associated with being exposed to active RF. But going back to that OSHA 1910.97 standard, which I pointed out before, it's sort of reminiscent of how hazardous gas detection works. It's not that if you're ever around, 1 part per million of every single element that's out there, you could be at risk. It's sort of the same concept with RF radiation. It's not that you're at risk anytime that there is any sort of radiation around you, but OSHA 1910.97 sets permissible exposure limits, which means for the amount of time that you spend in front of something which exceeds the exposure limits, you have to work your way out of it. We can get into the details of that later when we talk about training potentially.
Sure.
But essentially, you need to work your way in and out to keep yourself safe, but it's not going to be like you're getting an X-ray and you're instantly in a ton of danger. As far as what the hazards are, think about it sort of like warming, but the warming happens from within, right? So the risk that's associated with that is because you're not feeling hot on your skin as if it's, solar contact or just sort of heat.
Sitting next to a space heater.
Yeah, exactly. Or just it's a hot day, right? Sometimes it's harder to tell the difference between exhaustion because you're working and, RF exposure, essentially. So the risks that are associated with it are also largely the risks that would be associated with just overheating. So you've got dehydration, exhaustion, disorientation. At the worst case, typically with anything that would be in sort of cellular broadcast, you'd be looking at maybe seizures as well as unconsciousness, just if the overheating gets that extreme. The way that I like to think about RF concerns, though, is that it's not just the hazard that it itself poses, but it's the risks that are posed to the worker that finds himself in an otherwise dangerous situation already.
Right.
So if you're working, near the edge of a rooftop, or you're working in a bucket around something,
or with dangerous equipment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If you end up having some sort of episode, if the exposure gets bad enough that you get disoriented, or worst case scenario you become unconscious, does that also increase your fall risk? Does that also increase the risk that you drop objects? What happens to the people around you, etc.? So I think that gives you some idea of the risks. Again, it's not Chernobyl, right? But there are risks that are associated with continuous exposure to RF.
Yeah, and another piece is there are certain parts of the body that are more susceptible to RF, right?
That's true. I'm glad you mentioned that. If you think about just general soft tissues that are generally more sensitive to other risks, it's the same sort of thing. So think like eyes, ears, testes, breasts, etc., things like that.
Yeah.